Hello. I'm sorry. Hey you, and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host. Sorry, I was doing Mike from that chapter. People get mad at me when I did those videos. I'm going to do them again, just to kind of piss some of those people off. But this isn't what that video is. This is part 2 of how the United States became the most powerful country in the world. I went back a little bit, and here we go. Oh.
Communist governments to power, and the U.S. officially completed its growth, with the addition of Alaska and Hawaii as states. Eisenhower was still popular, but Nixon was less so, and in the 1960 election he was up against the charismatic Irish Catholic Senator John F. Kennedy, who beat the vice president in the closest election in the 20th century. The 1960s would be very different. 1960s. Kennedy took office alongside his vice president, Texas rival Senator Lyndon B. Johnson. Eisenhower had recently broken off diplomatic relations with Fidel Castro's Cuba, and this would become a flashpoint for his presidency. A failed invasion and coup in Cuba embarrassed the administration and was followed by a trade embargo, and only a year later the U.S. would come close to nuclear war when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missile facilities in Cuba. But Kennedy would have big wins in the space program, with Alan Shepard becoming the first American in space and John Glenn following in his footsteps as the first American to orbit the Earth. The civil rights leader Martin Luther King would give an inspiring speech known as "I Have a Dream" in a massive rally in Washington that would send the movement into overdrive. But the 60s were about to turn bloody. In 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald with a sniper rifle. Oswald would be killed by a mob-connected nightclub owner the next day, spawning decades of speculation. Lyndon B. Johnson took office amid national mourning and rose to the challenge, passing major economic reforms known as the Great Society, as well as a massive Civil Rights Act that ended many forms of discrimination, including segregation. It wasn't a surprise when he was easily elected president by a massive margin the next year, although growing U.S. involvement in Vietnam had people worried. He was riding high, but it wouldn't last. As more U.S. soldiers were deployed to Vietnam, anti-war protests started ramping up on college campuses. Johnson's commitment to civil rights was impressive as he signed major Voting Rights Act and appointed the first black judge to the Supreme Court. But it didn't stop increased racial tensions, which led to riots around the country. And
I don't want to see this. Don't need to see this. Yep. Okay. Sounds good. Back to the video. 12 minutes and probably have 6
around the
more
country.
ads.
And then came the wave of assassinations that shocked the world. First was civil rights activist Malcolm X, followed by the inspirational Martin Luther King Jr. As the 1968 election approached, Johnson decided not to seek re-election due to his poor approval ratings, and now the race was in chaos. The Democratic National Convention was besieged by anti-war activists, which played right into the hands of the returning Richard Nixon, who was victorious and promised to take the fight right back to the communists. And his first year in office would be eventful. Nixon recommitted the U.S. to Vietnam, seeking to turn the South Vietnamese army into a sustainable fighting force. The Stonewall riots in New York kicked off the modern gay rights movement, and the entire world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to walk on the moon. As the decade ended, Sesame Street premiered on TV. Surely, the 1970s would be less chaotic, right? 1970s. The century would start with the Kent State shootings that saw several student protesters die at the hands of the National Guard. 1970 and 71 also saw a shocking flood of celebrity deaths, with Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison all dying of drug overdoses at age 27. The voting age was officially lowered to 18, and Richard Nixon became the first president to visit communist China. He was a heavy favorite to win re-election, winning a shocking 49 states over staunch liberal George McGovern. No one paid too much attention to the break-in at the Watergate office complex at the time, but Nixon's second term would be very different from his first. 1973 saw several major events, including the Roe v. Wade ruling legalizing abortion and the U.S. ending direct involvement in Vietnam. Then Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace over a corruption scandal just as the government started investigating the break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters at Watergate. As more evidence of Nixon's direct involvement came out, Nixon started firing his attorney generals to protect himself. While the U.S. suffered under an Arab oil embargo, a House committee voted to impeach Nixon, and he resigned in disgrace, leading to his appointed Vice President Gerald Ford taking over. Ford chose to pardon Nixon, ending that affair and causing no shortage of anger. And that would spell his own political end.
Yeah.
The Democrats controlled Congress, and they led the way to a full withdrawal from Vietnam, resulting in the fall of Saigon not long after. Ford was nearly assassinated by 2 women within a 17-day period. Microsoft and Apple were both founded a year apart, and Americans celebrated their bicentennial. But as the election dawned, Ford seemed like a dead man walking. He barely won re-nomination over the charismatic conservative Ronald Reagan, limping into the general election. While the election was closer than expected, he lost his re-election to Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter, becoming the only president to never be voted into office by the public. And Carter's tenure wouldn't be any smoother. As the 39th president, he would oversee an economic crisis, a massive blackout in New York in 1977, and have some success in international affairs. He successfully negotiated peace between Israel and Egypt, and the Senate voted to turn over the Panama Canal to Panama in 20 years' time. But in 1979, the crisis that would define his presidency began. An Islamic fundamentalist coup in Iran led to a hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy that lasted over a year, coinciding with another energy crisis. Carter was seen as...
The one thing that hurt Carter on this was that near the end, as he was trying to negotiate, Ronald Reagan's people, not Ronald Reagan, but his people, were undermining the negotiations by basically saying, if you negotiate and you release the soldier or the people and everything, they were going to hit them with sanctions. We're the incoming president. So when Reagan took over, he had the release pretty much set, and he gets into office, they get released, and he immediately reached out, and he did reach out and tried to get a hold of Jimmy Carter, but he wasn't able to. Carter, I think, was on the plane or hadn't touched down yet. Anyways, he wasn't able to get a hold of him, and Carter found out as he landed or on the news or whatever. And I thought, it's a dick move, but again, it's politics.
Ineffectual, and his decision to boycott the 1980 Olympics in response to a Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia only made him more so. Much like Ford, Carter faced a fierce re-nomination battle from Ted Kennedy, and then was roundly defeated for re-election by Ronald Reagan. Who's ready for the 80s? 1980s. Ronald Reagan took office the same day that the hostages were released by Iran, an incident that some still find suspicious to this day. Many people feared the arch-conservative's new policies, but he almost didn't get to achieve any of them when he was seriously wounded by deranged assassin John Hinckley only 2 months after taking office. Reagan survived his wounds thanks to modern surgical techniques. Hinckley went to a mental...
When Reagan went to the hospital, I'm sure this is another thing people know about, but to me, this is another moment where it just shows you the person, and I think it's great. Reagan was about to be operated on, and he looked at the doctor and said, please tell me you're not a Democrat, or please tell me you're a Republican, something like that. And the doctor looked at him and then looked around the room and said, we're all Republicans today. And Reagan just kind of laughed. But you've been shot, you're dying. And in that moment, to have the ability to still put everyone at ease, just to make a joke please tell me you're a Republican. Some people are just, they just have it. And those people, they make it better. They make life better.
Institution, and Reagan was back at the Oval Office desk, signing tax cuts, firing striking air traffic controllers, and appointing Sandra Day O'Connor as the first woman on the Supreme Court. But soon his presidency would be dominated by foreign affairs. Tensions rose once again with the Soviet Union under Reagan, and a deadly suicide bombing killed 241 U.S. Marines in Lebanon. The U.S. also invaded Grenada amid political chaos in the island nation and created the Strategic Defensive Initiative missile system to fend off nuclear missiles. Reagan was controversial, but his tough approach to foreign threats won him a lot of support, so it wasn't surprising when he and his Vice President George Bush were re-elected in a landslide over Carter's VP Walter Mondale. But his second term would be rockier than the first. Concerns over Reagan's age were growing, and it seemed the president was a little out of it. Amid this, the Iran-Contra scandal involving illegal arms sales to Iran that benefited a far-right group in Nicaragua broke. The country was shocked when the Challenger space shuttle exploded shortly after taking off, killing everyone on board. But probably the biggest change was in the Soviet Union, where the previous hardlines
You're not fat, dude. Just the shirt. Okay, well that's... You just slapped him in the face.
Previous hardline Soviet leaders were replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev, who tried to liberalize the country and bring an end to the Cold War. Ironically, it would be Cold Warrior Reagan who would preside over the Great Thaw in relations. The two even signed a treaty reducing their nuclear stockpiles. Reagan was more than ready for retirement. But who was next? More than 2 terms for a party is rare, and Bush was seen as an underdog to Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. But when Dukakis was painted as soft on crime, Bush scored a massive victory and continued Reagan's legacy. His early presidency would be dominated by the environmental catastrophe of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, increased law enforcement against drugs, and a continuing thaw in relations with the Soviets. But as the 1990s approached, some big events were on the horizon. 1990s. When Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded the oil-rich nation of Kuwait, the U.S. was at war again. They joined 34 nations to fend off Saddam's invasion, but the Iraqi dictator was left in power, something that would be followed up on later. That same year, communist hardliners attempted to topple Gorbachev from power in Russia, but were fended off by the pro-democracy forces, leading the Soviet Union to collapse entirely. These foreign policy successes were enough to make Bush a heavy favorite for re-election. Or so it seemed. 1992 was a rough year. Race riots in Los Angeles and hurricanes in Hawaii and Florida scared many people. When Bush went back on his promise not to raise taxes, he lost much of his support. Texas billionaire Ross Perot waged an independent campaign for the presidency, but he largely split the vote in favor of the Democratic nominee, a young Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton, who had gone from obscurity to White House in just over a year. And Clinton's presidency would be, interesting. From the beginning, Clinton faced fierce opposition. He was accused of sexual harassment on the campaign trail, and he and his wife Hillary had their real estate dealings scrutinized. From the start, he was tested by foreign and domestic threats. A terrorist attack struck the parking garage of the World Trade Center in New York, killing 6 people, and a brutal standoff with a cult in Waco, Texas, left 81 people dead. Earthquakes and storms killed hundreds, and a 1995 massive terror bombing in an Oklahoma City federal building killed 168 people. Was America entering a new dark age? It became clear that while Oklahoma City was the work of a homegrown terrorist, many of the others were committed by radical Muslim terrorists from abroad. Amid more bombings, including a smaller attack at the Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Clinton was easily re-elected. He was still popular, but he was about to face his biggest challenge yet when he was accused of having a sexual relationship with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky. It sounded like a tabloid scandal, but the Republicans weren't laughing. And when he lied about the relationship under oath, he was impeached, only the second president ever to be impeached by the full House. He was ultimately acquitted by the Senate, but his administration would be defined by it. But hey, look at that calendar! The year 2000 was almost upon us, and scientists worked round the clock to prevent the Y2K bug from knocking all computer systems for a loop. An attack.
Anyone old enough to remember that? Oh my goodness. That was hell. Dude. All the power is going out when it flips over to 2000. We're gonna be back in Stone Ages, bruh. I was like, that's exactly what's gonna happen. I'm sure. I still remember the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! Lights are still on. They're still broadcasting on TV. A lot of people were wrong. Oh, it was crazy.
On the USS Cole, a naval destroyer, was the latest strike by the terror group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, a Saudi radical angry about the U.S. presence in the Middle East. And it was almost election time, which would pit Clinton's VP Al Gore against George W. Bush, the son of the man Clinton defeated. America watched and waited for the results, and waited. as the election came down to several hundred votes in Florida. Both sides sued to have the recount conducted their way, and ultimately the Supreme Court stepped in and ruled in Bush's favor, essentially making him the president-elect. One person who enjoyed that election night more than anyone? Hillary Clinton, who ran for and won a Senate seat while still First Lady. A new millennium, a new start? 2000s. The early days of Bush's presidency seemed surprisingly calm, with the president focusing on election reform. And then, 8 months after taking office, the world changed. 4 hijacked planes destroyed the World Trade Center in New York and hit the Pentagon in Washington, while the 4th crashed into an empty Pennsylvania field. In total, 3,000 Americans were killed in what turned out to be a massive strike by Osama bin Laden against the heart of America. Only days later, packages containing deadly anthrax started showing up in mailboxes, although this would turn out to be unrelated. In response to the attacks, Bush passed a series of anti-terror acts and launched a major military operation against Afghanistan, where bin Laden was hiding under the protection of the radical Taliban government. The 2000s would be defined by the September 11, 2001 attacks. America continued to be haunted by the terror attacks, and a series of sniper attacks around D.C. ramped up the tension. The Republicans regained control of the Senate, and in 2003, Bush asked Congress to authorize the invasion of Iraq to take Saddam Hussein out of power once and for all. He claimed Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, although they were never found. But many assume Saddam's attempt to kill his father in the 1990s might have been a factor as well. Saddam was deposed from office and captured less than a year into the war, but the U.S. would be fighting loyalists there for many years. Bush's decision to invade Iraq was controversial, but he would narrowly win re-election in 2006 over John Kerry. Maybe Kerry was overshadowed by a charismatic young state senator named Barack Obama, who spoke at the convention. But Bush's second term would not be what he was hoping for. Tension over the Iraq War continued to grow as anti-war forces condemned it. A massive hurricane in New Orleans devastated the city, and Bush's team was condemned for their slow response. The Democrats took back Congress in 2006, with Nancy Pelosi becoming the first female Speaker of the House. And as 2008 rolled around, a massive recession and stock collapse devastated the economy. It seemed the Democrats had it in the bag. The favored candidate was Hillary Clinton, who had been building her network for years. But she was shockingly upset in the primary by Barack Obama, who emphasized his opposition to the Iraq War. And in the 2008 election, Obama easily won, becoming the first black president of the United States. But would he be up to the task of fixing the country's many problems? For Obama's first 2 years, he had a filibuster-proof trifecta and used it to pass massive economic stimuli and healthcare reform. He passionately advocated for racial justice, but his opponents considered him a radical. Massive Tea Party protests around the country formed to oppose him. Republicans took back the House of Representatives in the next election, and Obama's agenda seemed to be stalled, as the former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney consolidated support to become the next U.S. president. Obama seemed to be on the ropes, until one day in 2011 when he announced that U.S. Special Forces had finally killed Osama bin Laden. This led to a massive boost in support for the Obama administration, and he and VP Joe Biden were handily re-elected in 2012. And Obama's second term would be as eventful as his first. A terror attack on the Boston Marathon shocked the country, and Hurricane Sandy devastated the eastern seaboard. Gay marriage was federally legalized by the Supreme Court, and the shooting death of Michael Brown in Missouri led to nationwide protests against police brutality and what would become the Black Lives Matter movement. Amid it all, Obama remained a steady but controversial figure, coming down strongly in favor of civil rights and change as the 2016 election neared. And that election would surely be business as usual, right? Wait, who's that coming down the staircase? Want to know more about one of the biggest events of the period?
You know what I'd really like to know? How the United States became the most powerful country in the world, because this did nothing. This was just a history video. Did anyone... I'm not trying to be a dick, but did anyone learn how, other than we just had presidents? Like, okay. I thought there'd be more to it than this. I'm a little disappointed. But I'm going to end this video here because I'm hungry. I'm going to go eat. Alright. I'm going to end this here. Like and subscribe. Put your fingers in your mouth and go...